Has the Bible been corrupted? A Christian response to a common Muslim claim. The first answer is to ask clarifying questions. If the Bible has truly been corrupted, there are several important questions that need to be answered. When did the corruption occur? Who corrupted it? Why was it corrupted? And where does the Quran explicitly state that the Bible has been corrupted, textually speaking? I'm not talking about wrong interpretations or twisting of the meaning of the text, but the corruption of the text itself. We'll get back to that in the last point. But the fact of the matter is that the Quran never claims that the text of the Bible has been corrupted. Number 2, consider the logical problems. How could Allah allow His revelations to be corrupted for centuries if the Quran itself states that no one can change His word? In Surah 6, 115, 1827, and 1064. If the Bible was truly corrupted, when did it happen and how was this accomplished? Furthermore, which came first, the Bible or the Quran? It seems far more reasonable to assume that any alleged corruption would have occurred in later documents rather than in the original text themselves. If God's word cannot be changed and the Bible predates the Quran by centuries, then the burden of proof rests on anyone claiming that the biblical text was fundamentally altered. So the evidence here is on the Muslim. They need to produce very clear textual evidence that the Bible has been corrupted. If not, Christians cannot take this claim seriously. Number 3, there is the testimony of the eyewitnesses. Jesus' closest disciples consistently testified to his divinity, death, and resurrection. If the Islamic claim of corruption is correct, this would mean that Jesus' nearest followers either misunderstood him completely or deliberately misrepresented him. Yet 600 centuries later, Muhammad, living far from the land, culture, and historical context of Jesus, claimed to have received the correct account. Which source would be considered to be more reliable? The eyewitnesses and their immediate associate who lived with Jesus and witnessed his ministry firsthand, or a man who lived approximately 600 years later and had no direct contact with the events? From a historical perspective and from the perspective of any historian, eyewitness testimony is generally given greater weight than later testimony, especially when separated by centuries. But what about the historical and textual evidence? That's the fourth point. The earliest copies of the Old Testament, including the Septuagint, date back to centuries before Christ. In addition, thousands of Old Testament manuscripts have survived. The New Testament is exceptionally well attested, with approximately 24,000 manuscript copies and fragments of various languages. Some of the earliest manuscripts date to around 125 to 150 AD. That is after the death of Christ, placing them remarkably close to the original writings. The vast manuscript tradition makes large-scale corruption extremely difficult to conceal. Textual scholars can compare manuscripts from different regions and periods to identify changes and reconstruct the original text with a very high degree of confidence. Even scholars who are critical of Christianity acknowledges this fact. Bart Ehrman, in Misquoting Jesus from 2005, says that the vast majority of textual variants are insignificant, involving matters like spelling, word order, or minor grammatical difference. Only a small percentage affect the meaning of the passage, and even fewer have a potential theological significance. So, according to Bart Ehrman, who Muslims themselves often quote against Christianity, actually confirm that the things that are taught in the Bible do not change as a result of these minor differences. Daniel Wallace, another very well-known textual critic, among the hundreds of thousands of textual variants found in the New Testament manuscripts, well over 99% are insignificant, according to Daniel Wallace. F.F. Bruce says, there is no body of ancient literature in the world which enjoys such a wealth of good textual attestation as the New Testament. In other words, the claim that the Bible has been fundamentally corrupted does not withstand historical or textual scrutiny. Either Jesus' disciples misrepresented him from the very beginning, or the Islamic claim regarding biblical corruption is mistaken. Given the available evidence, it is far more plausible that the biblical text, especially in its original form, has been faithfully preserved and that accusations of corruption arise from later interpretation rather than demonstrable historical facts. And that brings us to the fifth point, an illustrative analogy. Imagine that you spend 3 hours in a room with 12 people. During that time, those 12 individuals carefully record everything you say. Or they live in an oral culture who remembers. So people remember what is being said orally, and they have people who can memorize these sort of things in their heads. Now imagine that 600 to 800 years later, someone from a distant continent who never met you, never met the witnesses, and has no direct connection to the events that was happened, claims that he knows what you really said better than the people who are actually there. No serious historian would normally regard such claims as more reliable than the testimony of the original witnesses. While this argument may appear persuasive to someone who already accepts Islamic assumptions, it's generally not persuasive to non-Muslims who approach the issue from a historical and evidential perspective. And that brings us to the sixth point, the Islamic dilemma. This is one of the most well-known, maybe one of the most well-known arguments against Islam, and it's considered by a lot of people to be the best argument against Islam. The Islamic dilemma is a big problem for Muslims. Let's dig into the Islamic dilemma and explain what I mean by this. One of the strongest challenges to the claim that the Bible was corrupted is that it took roughly 400 years after Muhammad for a major Muslim scholar, Ibn Hazm, from 994 to 1064 AD, to develop a detailed argument that the biblical text itself has been corrupted. This raises important questions. If the Bible was obviously corrupted, why did it take 400 years for Muslims to identify and argue this systematically? What did Muslims believe about the Bible during those first 400 years? Why do we not find a clear doctrine of textual corruption in the earliest generations of Islam? This creates what many Christians call the Islamic dilemma. The Quran itself speaks positively about the Torah and the Gospels as revelations from God. The Bible we have today is substantially the same as the manuscripts that existed before Muhammad. The Bible and the Quran disagree on major theological issues. Therefore, either the Bible was already corrupted before Muhammad, raising questions about the Quran's affirmation of previous scriptures, or the Bible was not corrupted, raising questions about the Quran's contradictory claims. The fact that the textual corruption theory became prominent only about 400 years after Muhammad suggests it may have developed as an attempt to explain the growing recognition that the Bible and the Quran teach different things. Because in the Quran, the Muslims are to consult the people of the book, that is the Jews and the Christians, for guidance in Surah 1094 and 1643. You can also look at the book from Chris at Speaker's Corner, who has published a book that's doing pretty well on Amazon right now called The Islamic Dilemma, where he digs into this topic more deeply. But the problem is, regardless, that the Quran itself does not say that the Bible has been corrupted. This is a claim made 400 years later. In fact, the Quran seems to affirm the Bible. There is claims that are made that the Jews and Christians are twisting the meaning of the text. That is the biblical text. But that is a misinterpretation, accusing the Christians and the Jews of misinterpreting and twisting the text itself. There is no such thing in the Quran that says that the biblical text is corrupted. So regardless of what conclusions you come to, if the Quran is true, the Quran is false. If the Quran is false, the Quran is false. And if the Bible is true, the Quran is false. So regardless of how you ask this question, you will always come to a conclusion that the Quran is false and the Bible is true. This gives us the following conclusion. The question is not whether minor text variants exist in biblical manuscripts. They do, as well as in ancient literature. The real question is whether the Bible has been so corrupted that the core message has been lost. The historical evidence overwhelmingly suggests otherwise. The biblical text is supported by an unparalleled manuscript tradition, early sources, and the testimony of those closest to the events it records. The earliest biblical manuscripts predate Muhammad by centuries and contain the same essential message found in modern Bibles. Furthermore, the claim that the Bible was textually corrupted did not become a major Islamic argument until roughly 400 years after Muhammad. If the corruption was obvious and fundamental, it is difficult to explain why the earliest Muslims did not clearly and consistently make this claim. For that reason, the claim that the Bible has been fundamentally corrupted remains historically unsubstantiated and faces significant logical, textual, and evidential challenges. The burden of proof rests on those who assert corruption, and to date, no convincing historical evidence has demonstrated that the Bible's core message was ever lost or replaced. And that, I think, does, to some extent, answer the question, has the Bible been corrupted? And the answer to that question is no. The Bible has not been corrupted.